Electricity powers cities, lights homes, and runs the modern world, yet almost everyone carries the same wrong picture of how it works. The common idea is simple and comfortable. Electricity flows through wires, like water through pipes. This idea feels natural, easy to visualize, and easy to teach, but it is also deeply misleading. That single mental picture is the root of years of confusion, wrong explanations, and broken understanding. In this video, that picture will quietly fall apart. The truth about electricity is not just different. It is more subtle, more interesting, and far more powerful than most textbooks ever explain. What actually moves inside a wire is not what people think. What delivers energy is not what people imagine. And what makes a light turn on instantly is one of the most misunderstood processes in everyday science. By the end of this video, the old water flow idea will no longer make sense, and that is a good thing, because replacing it is a clearer, cleaner explanation that finally connects the missing pieces. This is not about complex math or advanced physics. This is about correcting one core mistake that shapes how people think about batteries, switches, power lines, safety, and even energy itself. The video will break down what is really happening inside a wire at the moment a switch is flipped, why electrons do not race from power plants to homes, and why distance barely matters the way people think it does. Along the way, lesser-known facts will quietly change how familiar objects are understood, from simple copper wires to massive electrical grids. The goal is not to overwhelm, but to untangle. Each idea builds naturally into the next, stripping away confusion instead of adding more layers. Watching until the end matters, because the final insight only makes sense after the misconception is fully exposed and replaced. Without that full journey, electricity still feels like a mystery filled with half-truths. With it, the system suddenly feels logical, almost elegant. This is the kind of explanation that stays in the mind long after the video ends, because it changes the way future explanations are heard and judged. Once this misconception is gone, many other confusing ideas about electricity quietly resolve themselves. That is why this topic matters. It is not trivia, it is a foundation, and foundations decide whether understanding stands or collapses. Welcome to the channel, a place where everyday science is explained clearly, honestly, and without shortcuts. If clear thinking matters, and if learning how the world really works excites you, subscribe now and stay with us, because this video is just the beginning. For a long time, the most common explanation of electricity has followed a single simple story that almost everyone learns early on, and that story begins at the power plant. Electricity, we are told, is generated far away and then sent toward homes, schools, and cities through long wires flowing steadily until it reaches lights, fans, and devices. The picture is clear and comforting. Electricity moves forward from one place to another, just like water pushed through a pipe. The wire becomes a kind of tunnel, and electricity becomes a substance that travels inside it. In this story, charges enter the wire at one end and leave at the other, completing a journey across distance. This idea feels natural because it matches everyday experience. Water flows through pipes, air flows through ducts, cars move through roads, so electricity, it seems, must flow the same way. Many explanations even say that positive charges move from the source to the device, reinforcing the sense of direction and travel. When a switch is flipped, electricity is imagined as being released, rushing forward and finally reaching the bulb, where light appears. This explanation sounds logical, neat, and complete. It feels like the kind of model that should work. But the problem is that it quietly plants a wrong image in the mind, one that becomes harder to remove with time. The mistake is not obvious at first because the model appears to explain results correctly. Flip the switch, the light turns on. Cut the wire, the light turns off. Everything seems to match the story, but beneath the surface the picture does not match what actually happens inside the wire. The belief that electricity is about charges traveling long distances sets up expectations that reality does not follow. It suggests that speed matters in the wrong way, that distance matters more than it does, and that the wire is empty until something is sent through it. This belief leads directly to the biggest misconception of all, the idea that electricity is mainly about electrons racing from one end of a wire to the other. In this view, electrons are imagined as tiny particles launched from the power plant, sprinting through kilometers of copper to deliver energy to a device. The faster they run, the faster the device responds. The longer the wire, the longer it should take. The switch becomes a gate that releases a stream of fast-moving particles. This image is repeated in simplified diagrams, animations, and classroom explanations until it feels almost unquestionable. But this is where the misunderstanding becomes complete. Electricity in real life does not depend on electrons making long journeys through wires. Electrons are not injected into empty metal and sent racing toward homes. They are already there. Every metal wire is already full of electrons long before any switch is touched. These electrons belong to the atoms that make up the metal itself. In copper, aluminum, and other conductors, electrons exist in enormous numbers, packed throughout the entire structure of the wire. They are not waiting at the power plant. They are not lined up at the start of the cable. They fill every section of the wire evenly, from one end to the other, even when nothing is turned on. The wire is never empty. It is already crowded. When a circuit is open, these electrons are not flowing in a useful way, but they are still there, vibrating, interacting, and existing as part of the material. Turning on a switch does not send new electrons into the wire from far away. It changes the conditions inside a system that is already full. When the switch closes the circuit, the electrons throughout the wire respond almost together, not because they are traveling fast over long distances, but because they are already in place. Each electron shifts slightly, influenced by forces that spread through the material. The movement involved is surprisingly small. Instead of racing across meters or kilometers, each electron drifts a tiny amount. In many cases, the distance is so small, it is measured in fractions of a millimeter. Over time, electrons may slowly drift in a general direction, but this motion is slow, often slower than walking speed, and sometimes far slower. This fact alone clashes with the water flow picture. If electricity depended on electrons traveling from the power plant to the home, lights would not turn on instantly. There would be a delay as particles made the journey, but that delay does not happen because the journey is not what matters. The electrons that respond to the switch are the same electrons that were already inside the wire near the bulb. They do not arrive from far away. They adjust locally. Each one nudges its neighbor, creating a chain of interactions that spreads through the wire. The idea of electrons racing through empty space dissolves when this is understood. The wire behaves less like a pipe and more like a solid structure, already filled with charges, where changes propagate through relationships rather than transport. This difference may sound subtle, but it completely changes how electricity should be pictured. The power plant does not send electrons on a long trip. It sets up conditions that influence electrons everywhere in the circuit. The wire does not act as a highway. It acts as a medium already prepared to respond. When the switch is flipped, nothing new is injected into the metal. Instead, something already present is reorganized. This is why the traditional explanation fails quietly. It explains outcomes without explaining mechanisms. It gives motion where there is mostly interaction. It replaces fields and forces with traveling objects, because that feels easier to picture. But ease of picture is not accuracy. Inside the wire, electrons exist as part of a sea of charge, loosely bound and free to shift, but not free to sprint across space. Their collective behavior matters more than individual travel. The small drift that does occur is enough to support current, but it is not responsible for the immediate response seen in electrical devices. That response comes from changes that spread through the entire system nearly at once. By holding on to the old belief, explanations become tangled. Questions about speed, distance, and delay start to pile up. The confusion does not come from electricity itself, but from the mental model used to explain it. Once the assumption of long-distance electron travel is removed, the behavior of circuits begins to align with reality. The wire stops being a pipe. The electrons stop being messengers running back and forth. They become participants in a system that was already complete before the switch was ever touched. The moment a switch is turned on and a light glows without delay seems almost magical, and this instant response is where the old picture of electricity quietly breaks down. The key idea begins here, because the speed of the light turning on is not explained by electrons rushing through the wire. If electricity depended on electrons traveling long distances, the response would never be immediate. There would always be a pause, however small, as particles made their way from the source to the bulb. But that pause is not observed. The reason is simple. Once the focus shifts away from electron speed and towards something far more important, electricity is not mainly about how fast electrons move. It is about the electric field. The electric field is an invisible condition that exists around charges and spreads through space and materials. When a circuit is completed, when the switch closes, the electric field establishes itself along the entire length of the wire, almost at the speed of light. This field does not wait for electrons to travel. It appears and adjusts everywhere nearly at once. The field applies a force to electrons that are already present throughout the wire, gently pushing them into motion at the same time. Each electron responds locally, feeling the influence of the field right where it sits. This is why the bulb responds instantly. The electrons near the bulb do not wait for instructions from far away. They are already in place, and the moment the field reaches them, they begin to move and transfer energy. The speed of the field is what matters, not the drift of individual electrons. This distinction changes everything. The field carries information and energy through the circuit. The electrons simply respond. To make this clearer without adding confusion, it helps to think in terms of a physical system where movement does not require long travel. Picture a long row of marbles, all touching, stretched across a table. Each marble rests against the next, forming a continuous line. When one marble at the beginning is pushed forward, it does not travel all the way to the end. Instead, it barely moves, transferring its push to the marble next to it. That transfer continues through the line. Almost immediately, the marble at the far end moves, even though none of the marbles in between traveled very far. The action spreads through contact, not distance. Electricity works in a similar way. The wire is already full of electrons, just like the row is already full of marbles. Closing the switch is like applying a push that spreads through the entire system. The electrons in the middle do not rush forward. They shift slightly, passing along influence and energy. This analogy is not perfect, but it captures the key point that motion at one end does not require travel across the whole length. Understanding this helps explain why the light responds so quickly, and why long wires do not introduce the delays people expect. This misconception matters more than it first appears, because it shapes how people think about power itself. When electricity is imagined as a stream of fast particles, it becomes difficult to understand how energy is delivered, where losses occur, and why certain safety rules exist. Batteries, for example, are often thought of as containers that send electrons out, when in reality they create conditions that establish fields and drive motion within a closed system. Circuits become confusing because people look for moving objects instead of relationships between charges and fields. Energy loss is misunderstood because it is linked to resistance and field interactions, not to electrons getting tired as they travel. Safety becomes a problem because the danger is not about how many electrons are flowing past a point, but about the strength of fields and the potential differences involved. When the focus stays on fast electrons, explanations stay shallow and misleading. When the focus shifts to the electric field, the behavior of electrical systems becomes consistent and predictable. It becomes clear why touching certain parts of a circuit is dangerous, while others are not, why grounding works the way it does, and why voltage matters more than distance. At the same time, it is important to clear away a different kind of confusion that can appear once this idea is introduced. Electrons do move. They are not frozen in place, but their movement is slow and limited. In many everyday circuits, the average drift speed of electrons is extremely small. They shuffle along, colliding with atoms, transferring energy through these interactions. This slow drift supports current, but it does not carry signals or power in the way people usually imagine. The energy moves fast. The signal moves fast. The electric field carries changes through the system rapidly. The electrons simply respond to that field where they already are. Keeping this balance is important. Saying electrons do not race does not mean they do nothing. It means their role is different from what the water flow picture suggests. Electricity is not a river of electrons pouring through empty space. It is a system already filled with charges, ready to respond when conditions change. The electric field is the real messenger, setting the entire system into coordinated motion. Once this idea settles in, many confusing questions quietly disappear. The instant response of devices no longer seems mysterious. The behavior of long wires no longer seems strange. Electricity stops being a story about particles traveling and becomes a story about forces spreading and charges responding. With this shift, the behavior of circuits begins to feel natural instead of surprising, and the everyday world of switches, lights, and power starts to make sense in a deeper and more connected way. This is just one misconception, quietly passed down for years, shaping how electricity is explained and understood. There are many more ideas like this, hiding inside everyday science, simple on the surface, but completely different once you look a little deeper. When these hidden ideas are uncovered, familiar things stop feeling ordinary and start making sense in a new way. The world becomes less mysterious and more connected, not because it is simplified, but because it is finally explained honestly. If this shift in understanding felt surprising, then there is much more waiting ahead. This channel exists to explore those overlooked details, the small misunderstandings that change everything once they are corrected. If you enjoy learning how things really work, take a moment to like this video so more people can discover it. Share it with someone who loves science, and subscribe to the channel for more clear, thoughtful explanations that reveal the deeper story behind the everyday world.